not to mention their Historical Society and Chamber of Commerce and a whole variety of different support from Virginia Beach, who have put together this very lovely wreath, which I'm going to ask you, how many names are on that?
We had about 1,400 elementary school children from across the city participate in this project where they wrote on these leaves. So there are about 1,400 leaves on here.
So we really appreciate their support of George Washington. And just very briefly, when you come to Mount Vernon, we have a little program which we call the Genius of George Washington. And we like to say the genius of George Washington was one word, and it was power. And George Washington never abused it. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. At the end of 8.5 years, George Washington is away in the American Revolution for 8.5 years. When the peace treaty is finally signed, he goes to Annapolis and he resigns his commission with a very brief speech in which he says, I have accomplished the task assigned to me. A rather modest comment after 8.5 years defeating the largest army and navy in the world, but he said, I want to return my commission. He said, I consider it a public trust and it should be returned to the government. And I would like to add, I want you to think of Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon, Lenin, Mao, Castro. They all led successful revolutions. Not one of them had any intention of relinquishing the power except George Washington. He knew if he kept that power, we wouldn't have the grand experiment of our government. 2 years earlier, a group of his officers got very upset that they hadn't been treated properly by the Continental Congress. They hadn't been paid properly, they hadn't been supported properly, and they said, let's march on Philadelphia, take over the government, and make George Washington our military dictator. In a letter, he said that was his greatest personal challenge of the entire American Revolution. All would be lost. So he called those officers together, came in late, they all got quiet, 6'2½", a commanding presence. He did make some adjustments with his glasses. He said, you'll have to excuse me, I've grown blind in the service of my country, I've grown gray. Then he stopped and he looked each and every one of them in the eye and he said, your brethren in the field did not die to create a military dictatorship. We have been created by Congress. We report to Congress and the military is subservient. The military reports to the civilian government. If we had had Julius Caesar, Napoleon, we wouldn't have this country we have today. They would have been glad to keep that power. He understood power, and he understood that it had to reside in the government. In fact, when they finally decided that the Articles of Confederation weren't working properly, they created a committee, an organization that ultimately became known as the Constitutional Convention, in which time they talked about how our government should be organized, what the branches of government should look like, and how the power should be shared with the judiciary and the legislature and the president. And George Washington was convinced that the president should not be president for life. He was convinced that what was going to be important in this grand experiment was not the election of the first president, but the election of the second president. A peaceful transition of power. Every other government, the power was transferred by bloodshed or by bloodlines. And many people think that's probably one of the greatest contributions George Washington made to our country. We argue, we disagree, but when we finally select, when the people finally elect a president, there is a peaceful transition. And of course, when he took the oath of office in New York, he surprised the audience. In essence, he said, at the conclusion of a very brief address, well, this grand experiment, he calls our government a grand experiment. He said, it's not for you. It's for yet unborn millions, but it will be their responsibility to keep the sacred flames of liberty alive. That's what the Mount Vernon Ladies Association is all about. When you come here, you learn your history. You learn the accomplishments of the Founding Fathers. You learn the accomplishments of George Washington. Because As a nation, if we become historically illiterate, a very dangerous thing happens. We become complacent. We take our country for granted. We need to remember there was a great deal of courage, wisdom, and I can't emphasize enough the last sacrifice to create this country. But as George Washington said, it'll only be successful if every generation knows that courage, wisdom, sacrifice, and is willing to make that same commitment and have that same courage, wisdom, and sense of sacrifice. So that's what the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, I keep talking about the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. I hope you all understand Mount Vernon is not owned by the government. It's owned by a group of women that bought it in 1858. The last Washington living here, John Augustine Washington, he was a great-grandnephew. This is his memorial. He said he didn't want to live here anymore. He said too many tourists were coming. He said he couldn't even eat his breakfast without people looking in the window. It became a tourist attraction. So to his credit, he's not going to sell it to someone unless they agree to keep it as George Washington's home. On the other hand, in 1853, he wants $200,000. So he presents that to Congress, and I know this is going to surprise a lot of you, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Congress could not come to an agreement. And so as a result of that, a nice lady from South Carolina was going down the Potomac and said, if the men of America won't save it, the women will. And between 1853 and 1858, they purchased it, and it's been open to the public ever since. So education is a really important part of your experience here at Mount Vernon. So I hope you've had a chance to go in the Orientation Center, and I hope you'll take the opportunity to go through our Museum and Education Center, where there's just a lot of information about how our country was created and why it was created. So I'm going to ask these ladies if they would follow me and stand in the tomb. And stand behind it and stand on either side of it. And if somebody has a camera, I'll take a portrait. Here we go. Now, guys, I don't have a picture here.
Just need to look in there.
I'll look through there. Okay. I'll say I'm going to count to 3 and make sure I see everybody. And we're not going to say cheese, we're going to say George Washington. 1, 2, 3.
George Washington.
All right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they're going to step out here and they're going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And just leave the wreath right there. That's one of the larger wreaths we've had. And if you'd all face the flag and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'm going to ask this young lady if she wouldn't mind reading what we call George Washington's prayer for his country. At the end of the American Revolution, George Washington wrote a letter to the 13 governors encouraging them to create a stronger sense of government, a stronger central government. During the American Revolution, he has to write to 13 people, 13 governors. And at the end of that letter, he writes what we call George Washington's prayer for his country. And I'll ask her to just very briefly read that, if you'd all bow your heads.
I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have the United States in his holy protection, that he would incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another, for their fellow citizens of the United States at large, and particularly for their brethren who have served in the field. And finally, that he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to deem ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, and without an humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation. Amen.
And I talk far too much because nobody listens to me at home, but I'm going to ask her to just tell us a little bit more about your organization.
Well, my name is Kim Schmidtman, and I'm one of the educators with the Virginia Beach History Museums, and we are here with this laurel leaf wreath that we got through our HERO team, which stands for History Education Resource Opportunities, which is a team of libraries, public schools, the museums, and a lot of other great people in the city of Virginia Beach. We reached out to the elementary schools, and we had the school children write on a laurel leaf what they thought, believed, felt about George Washington. And then we had one of our great volunteers assemble it onto this wreath. If you're ever in Virginia Beach, please come to the Adam Thorogood house, because we do have a connection to George Washington. It was Adam Thorogood who brought over George Washington's great-grandfather, Augustine Warner, under the headright system. So that is our connection to here, and we're very proud of that. We're very proud to bring and present this wreath as a collaboration. So we're glad that it's going to be on display here, and we're just really happy to be here.
Well, we want to thank all of you for all that effort and for having this nice ceremony this morning. And I forget, there was one of you that said you were going to announce your candidacy for President of the United States. Is that- Yeah. Well, she said you have to do it very early. So she also said something that I didn't know how to take at first, but I realized she was right. She said the men have really messed it up. So thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.
Now, that's going to be on display, and then at the end of the day, we're going to take it up and put it in the education center.
Thank you so much.
So thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot. Thank you.